What if the people least fit to lead are the ones most likely to end up in charge? Picture this. You walk into a government chamber or a corporate boardroom, and the person holding the most power is also the one who probably deserves it the least. That's not just a fluke, that might actually be how the system is designed to work. From politics to business to global institutions, we keep seeing the same pattern over and over again. Take Richard Nixon, for example. A man who climbed all the way to the top of American politics, intelligent, experienced, and undeniably driven. But once he got there, the Watergate scandal exposed just how far he was willing to go: paranoia, deception, moral compromise. And yet, ironically, those very same traits, his ruthlessness, his pragmatism, his willingness to break the rules, were part of what helped him rise in the first place. This isn't new. Nearly 500 years ago, Niccolò Machiavelli saw the same thing happening in Renaissance Italy. In his infamous book The Prince, he wrote, "Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everyone to see you, but few to touch you. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." Translation? When it comes to leadership, appearances matter more than reality. People care more about how a leader looks or sounds than whether they're actually qualified or competent. And Machiavelli wasn't saying that's a good thing, just that it's true. And modern research backs him up. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who appear confident are often rated as more competent, even when their actual performance doesn't support it. In other words, we confuse confidence for ability all the time. So today, we're diving deep into a big, uncomfortable question. Why do our systems reward narcissism, dishonesty, and even foolishness in leadership? And maybe more importantly, what can we do about it? We'll explore Machiavelli's insights, compare them to modern psychology, and look at rare exceptions, leaders who defy this pattern and actually lead with wisdom, empathy, and effectiveness. Let's start with one of Machiavelli's core principles. He wrote, "The prince must consider how to avoid those things which make him hated or contemptible. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, or irresolute." In modern terms, leaders are expected to project confidence, decisiveness, and strength. That expectation gives narcissistic personalities a huge edge in leadership competitions. Here's a scenario. Imagine you're lost in the woods with a group of strangers. Two people offer to lead. One says, "I think I know the way, but I'm not totally sure. There are a few paths we could take." The other says, "I know exactly where we need to go. Follow me." Even though the first person is being more honest, because, let's face it, nobody's really sure in that kind of situation, most people will follow the second person. Why? Because we're hardwired to follow confidence, even when it's baseless. You've probably seen this happen in your own workplace or community. That magnetic pull toward the person who sounds the most sure of themselves. A massive meta-analysis published in Personnel Psychology looked at 54 studies on narcissism and leadership. The verdict? The traits that help narcissists rise to the top, charisma, self-confidence, boldness, aren't the same traits that make for successful leadership once they're in the role. In fact, narcissistic CEOs bring 27% more volatility to company performance, and their decisions are 33% more likely to trigger negative reactions from the market. A perfect example: Adam Neumann, the former CEO of WeWork. He convinced investors his co-working startup was worth $47 billion, even though it was bleeding money. His massive self-confidence and wild, visionary pitch made him look like the next Steve Jobs. But when reality caught up with the hype, the company's value collapsed by more than 80%. Why does this happen? It's not a mystery. Psychology shows that in uncertain situations, we naturally look for confidence, even false confidence. In fact, one study put it this way: we prefer confidence over accuracy. Let that sink in. We'd rather be led by someone who sounds sure, even if they're wrong, than by someone who honestly admits they're unsure. Machiavelli put it more poetically: nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great enterprises and setting a fine example. In other words, looking like a bold, visionary leader earns more respect than quietly doing the right thing behind the scenes. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are exceptions. Take Seretse Khama, the founding president of Botswana. He didn't build a personality cult. He didn't centralize power. Instead, he led with humility and institution building. Under his leadership, Botswana went from being one of Africa's poorest countries to one of its most stable democracies. When he took office in 1966, the country's GDP was just $69 million. By the year 2000, over $8.4 billion. Life expectancy rose from 52 to 65, all that while rejecting the narcissistic playbook most post-colonial leaders followed. So what made him different? He focused on outcomes, not image. Integrity, not charisma. That kind of leadership proves that while narcissism might get you into power, it takes something much deeper to use that power well. Which brings us to an important question. When you think about the leaders who've actually transformed something, your company, your community, your country, what stands out? Were they flashy, bold, and theatrical? Or thoughtful, steady, and quietly competent? Maybe we need to stop rewarding the performance of leadership and start looking closer at the substance behind it. Let's talk about one of Machiavelli's most misunderstood and most controversial ideas. He wrote, "Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is for a prince to keep his word and to live with integrity. But experience shows that the princes who've done great things have often valued their word very little and have succeeded through cunning and manipulation." Yikes. That sounds rough, right? Modern readers often think Machiavelli was promoting lying. But that's not what he was doing. He was observing something uncomfortable but true. Leaders who are willing to bend the truth often end up getting ahead. Not because lies are good, but because people are surprisingly easy to manipulate. And the most powerful kind of deception. It's not loud, obvious, or cartoonishly evil. It's subtle, like a magician's sleight of hand. You're watching their right hand waving in the air, while their left hand quietly palms the card. Political leaders, and corporate ones too, use the same trick. They highlight whatever stats or stories look good, and quietly bury the ones that don't. They tell a story people want to believe, knowing full well it won't hold up to scrutiny. But here's the thing, people rarely scrutinize it. Why? Because of how our brains work. We're all vulnerable to what psychologists call optimism bias. It's a mental shortcut where we interpret information in ways that support our hopes and desires. We wear rose-colored glasses, whether we realize it or not. So, when a leader frames a situation positively, we're not losing money, we're investing in the future. We often go along with it, even when the facts suggest otherwise. In corporate communications, you'll see this all the time. Losses get spun as strategic pivots. Modest wins are framed as breakthroughs. And we eat it up, not because we're gullible, but because we're human. A study out of the University of Michigan found that leaders who framed challenges in a more positive light actually boosted employee morale and productivity by 31%, even when the company was objectively struggling. So in a weird way, strategic deception works. Not because it's truthful, but because it feeds into our psychological tendencies. And Machiavelli understood this better than most. He wrote, "In the actions of all men, especially princes, when there is no higher court of judgment, people look only to the end result. If a prince succeeds, people will always judge the means as honorable." It's basically, the ends justify the means. And while that can be dangerous in the wrong hands, it's also often how society actually operates. But not every organization plays that game. Let's look at Patagonia. Under its founder, Yvon Chouinard, the company took an opposite approach, one that seemed totally counterintuitive at the time. They practiced radical transparency. They openly admitted the environmental cost of their own products. They even launched a campaign telling customers, "Don't buy this jacket." Most companies would never discourage people from buying, but that honesty became part of Patagonia's brand. And here's the kicker, it worked. Their revenue grew from $295 million to $1.5 billion, and customer loyalty shot past the industry average by 38%. Being honest, even about hard truths, earned them more trust, not less. Which leads us to an important point. Deception in leadership isn't just about lying to others. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones leaders tell themselves. A 2023 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes found that power increases self-deception by 42%. That's huge. That creates a disturbing feedback loop. The leader believes their own myth, which makes them more convincing to others, which strengthens their position, which reinforces their belief in their myth, and on it goes. How do we break that loop? Well, Machiavelli gave us a clue when he wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the people he surrounds himself with. Smart leaders surround themselves with smart people. Insecure leaders surround themselves with fools." And that brings us to another strange paradox in leadership. Sometimes, being too smart or too honest can actually hurt your chances of getting selected as a leader. Why? Because our brains are drawn to simplicity. Think of the so-called beer test in politics. Voters often say they'd rather elect someone they'd like to have a beer with than someone who's too intellectual or complex. It sounds silly, but it's backed by psychology. There's a phenomenon called the pratfall effect. Highly competent people who reveal small flaws or seem relatable become more likable than people who appear flawless and distant. George W. Bush understood this well. Even though he had degrees from Yale and Harvard Business School, he leaned into a simple, folksy style of communication that resonated with many voters. Some people mocked it, but it worked. We crave clarity. We want certainty. And in a world full of ambiguity and complexity, we gravitate toward leaders who give us easy answers, even when the truth is complicated. A Stanford study of nearly 1,000 CEOs found that those who communicated in simpler language were 23% more likely to be hired. They also earned higher starting pay. But there's a catch. Those same CEOs were 31% more likely to underperform in complex business environments. Simplicity got them the job. But nuance is what the job actually required. Machiavelli saw this dynamic clearly. He wrote, "A prince ought to have no other aim or thought than war and its discipline. For this is the only art that belongs to the one who rules." Now, Machiavelli wasn't just talking about literal war. He meant leaders should focus on practical action, not abstract theory. But the modern twist on that is what we might call the complexity trap. the people best equipped to navigate the hard realities of leadership, those who admit what they don't know, who weigh pros and cons, who understand nuance, often don't look like strong leaders, and so they're passed over. Meanwhile, those who oversimplify and project certainty rise to the top. It's not just a problem with leaders, it's a problem with how we choose leaders. Let's keep going with a quote you've probably heard, even if you've never read Machiavelli. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. That's one of the most debated lines in political philosophy. At first glance, it sounds like a straight-up endorsement of cruelty. But that's not what Machiavelli was saying. He wasn't telling leaders to be monsters. He was saying that when forced to choose, when circumstances demand hard decisions, it's often safer for a leader to command fear than to rely solely on being loved. In other words, sometimes being too empathetic can actually get in the way of leading effectively. And modern psychology agrees. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people in positions of power actually show reduced mirror neuron activity. That's the brain mechanism tied to empathy, when they observe others in distress. That sounds cold, but researchers believe it's not necessarily a flaw. It might be an adaptation, a coping mechanism that allows leaders to make tough decisions without being emotionally paralyzed. Think of it like this. If a surgeon felt the full emotional weight of slicing into someone during surgery, they might hesitate, and that hesitation could cost a life. The emotional detachment allows them to do what needs to be done. Leadership can work the same way. Whether it's cutting budgets, laying off staff, or choosing the lesser of two bad options, being too empathetic in the moment can prevent necessary action. Have you ever been in that situation, where doing what's best for the group meant making a choice that hurt someone in the short term? It's not easy, and it's definitely not fun. But it's often part of the job. This dynamic helps explain why narcissistic or low empathy individuals sometimes thrive in leadership roles. Not because they're better leaders in the long run, but because they're more comfortable with decisions that make others uncomfortable. A University of California study found that people who scored high in narcissism were 30 not because they were more competent, but because they projected control and confidence, and they didn't hesitate. Machiavelli captured this brilliantly when he wrote, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities, that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." That line might sound bleak, but it's also incredibly insightful. People want to believe. They want certainty, they want clarity, and they want to feel like someone is in charge, even if that person is manipulating them. And here's where things get even more interesting. Machiavelli also said, "It is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, and to be so. But you must also be prepared, when necessary, to change to the opposite." He's not saying virtues are bad. He's saying virtues are context-dependent. Sometimes honesty, humility, or kindness are the right tools. Sometimes they aren't. Angela Merkel, Germany's former chancellor, is a great modern example of this kind of flexible leadership. During the 2015 European refugee crisis, she made the bold decision to welcome over 1 million refugees into Germany. It was an incredibly empathetic choice, but also one that required navigating fierce public backlash, economic concerns, and political risk. If she had been purely emotional or purely calculating, the decision might have collapsed. But her leadership worked because she balanced compassion with pragmatism. That's the heart of Machiavelli's real message. It's not lie and cheat your way to power. It's understand how power works, understand human psychology, and know which virtues actually help in each situation. This brings us to something called servant leadership, a concept introduced by Robert Greenleaf in the 1970s. The basic idea? The best leaders serve others, not themselves. One of the most powerful case studies of servant leadership is Costco, under former CEO Jim Sinegal. While other retail giants were cutting costs by slashing wages and benefits, Sinegal did the opposite. He paid Costco workers an average of 40% more than competitors and gave health care to 85% of employees, when the industry average was less than half that. The result? Costco's turnover rate was just 17%, compared to the industry average of 44%. And during Sinegal's tenure, Costco's stock outperformed Walmart by a whopping 300%. That's what happens when leadership isn't just about winning, but about building something sustainable. So here's the real challenge. It's not about choosing between being virtuous or being effective. It's about having the wisdom to know when, and how, those virtues serve the greater good. The philosopher Aristotle, who Machiavelli had definitely read, put it this way: virtue isn't about rigid rules, it's about applying the right principle in the right situation. In other words, good leadership is context-sensitive, and that leads us to one of Machiavelli's most important observations. There is such a difference between how one lives and how one ought to live, that anyone who tries to live how they ought to live will bring about their own ruin instead of preservation. Let that settle for a moment. That might sound cynical, but what Machiavelli is doing here is revealing a painful truth. The gap between ideal leadership and real-world leadership is huge, and pretending that gap doesn't exist just sets us up for disappointment, or worse, exploitation. It's kind of like casting an actor to play a doctor in a movie versus hiring a real doctor in a hospital. The actor might look the part, confident, charming, tall, great hair, but you don't want them anywhere near an actual surgery. Leadership works the same way. The person who looks like a leader isn't always the one who can actually lead. So the real question becomes, why do we keep rewarding the performance of leadership instead of the practice of it? So let's get to the core of the paradox. The traits that help someone win leadership roles, boldness, confidence, charisma, are often the same traits that make them bad at actually leading. Meanwhile, the people who would be steady, thoughtful, and effective, they often get passed over because they don't look the part. Modern psychology calls this the leadership paradox. Studies show that individuals with narcissistic tendencies are more likely to emerge as leaders in group settings. But once they're in charge, those same traits, self-centeredness, impulsiveness, lack of empathy, often undermine their performance and hurt the organization. It's like our leadership selection process is wired to favor the wrong people. Not because we want bad leaders, but because we're drawn to traits that look like leadership, even when they're not. Why does this happen? Part of the answer goes way back, like evolutionary back. Humans evolved in environments where threats were physical, immediate, and visible. In those situations, we needed dominant figures, people who were tall, loud, confident, and unafraid to act. Leaders who could physically protect the group. And those instincts are still with us. A study from the University of California showed that our modern leadership preferences are shockingly similar to those found in chimpanzees. We're still influenced by things like height, vocal authority, body language, and perceived dominance. The problem is, those traits don't help much in a modern office or in the Oval Office. Today's challenges are more about collaboration, innovation, and long-term thinking, not who can bang their chest the loudest. But we haven't updated our instincts. We still gravitate toward the alpha type, and we mistake it for competence. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He wrote, "The people desire not to be oppressed. The nobles desire to oppress the people. The two forces are always in conflict." What he meant was this: the people often just want stability and fairness, but the ruling class, the ones vying for power, usually want domination and control. And because they're the ones chasing leadership most aggressively, they're often the ones who get it. In other words, the people most eager to lead are often the ones least suited to do it well. But not always. There are some rare and powerful exceptions, leaders who didn't pursue power for its own sake, but earned it through moral authority and a commitment to service. Take Nelson Mandela, for example. He spent 27 years in prison, not for seeking power, but for fighting apartheid. When he finally became president of South Africa, he didn't seek revenge. He led with reconciliation, unity, healing. Or look at Abraham Lincoln. At first, many people saw him as awkward, unrefined, too introspective. But in the middle of America's darkest hour, his empathy, humility, and deep moral clarity proved essential. His leadership wasn't about dominance. It was about holding the country together when it was literally falling apart. These kinds of leaders don't fit the Machiavellian mold, but they succeed because of their character, not in spite of it. So what can we learn from that? Maybe we need to change how we choose leaders, because Machiavelli wasn't just describing leadership. He was also warning us. He famously said, "It is not necessary for a prince to have all the good qualities, but it is very necessary to appear to have them." That one line sums up a massive problem. If appearances matter more than reality, then we've got a system that rewards performance over substance. And unless we redesign that system, we'll keep getting leaders who are great at getting power and terrible at using it. Some ancient societies understood this. The Venetian Republic had a complex system for choosing its leaders, a mix of elections and random selection. The point was to make it nearly impossible for any one faction to seize total control. Other societies used term limits or forced leaders to give up power temporarily to reduce the chance of corruption. So what about today? Can we build better systems? Actually, yes. Some modern organizations are experimenting with ways to fight these biases. Take Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund. Founder Ray Dalio created a culture of radical transparency. That means every employee, even interns, can critique the CEO's decisions. Every leader gets regularly reviewed through anonymous feedback. Why does this work? Because it stops echo chambers. It prevents narcissistic leaders from insulating themselves with yes men. And it builds a culture where results matter more than charm. There are a few other steps organizations can take too. Prioritize track records over performance in interviews. Studies show that how someone has behaved in the past is a better predictor of future success than how well they perform in a high-pressure conversation. Use trial periods. Don't hand over the keys right away. Let someone prove themselves first. Collect 360-degree feedback from team members at every level. Separate proposal and approval power. One person shouldn't be able to suggest an action and approve it unilaterally. That's how unchecked power breeds disaster. Appoint formal devil's advocates. Their job is to challenge assumptions and bring alternative viewpoints to the table, even when it's uncomfortable. Rotate leadership and impose term limits. Long-term power almost always leads to psychological decay. Change is a safeguard. The truth is, power changes people, even good people, and systems that allow power to go unchecked will eventually get burned. Which is why Machiavelli's real lesson might be this: don't just look at the leaders. Look at the systems that put them there. Let's wrap this up by returning to one of Machiavelli's most famous metaphors. He wrote, "A prince, being forced to adopt the nature of the beast, must choose both the fox and the lion. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. So you must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to scare the wolves. It's a powerful image and a brilliant metaphor for what great leadership requires. The fox represents strategic wisdom, the ability to see through deception, understand complex environments, and navigate hidden dangers. The lion represents moral courage, the strength to take bold action and stand firm when it matters most. And Machiavelli's point is clear. To lead effectively, you can't be just one or the other. You need both. But here's the twist. Maybe the real lesson isn't about shaping better individuals. Maybe it's about building better systems. Systems where even flawed leaders can't do too much damage, and where good leaders are empowered to do their best work. This is exactly what James Madison, one of America's founding fathers, had in mind when he helped design the U.S. Constitution. He famously wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Madison understood the Machiavellian view better than most. Instead of designing a government that relied on virtuous leaders, he built a system of checks and balances, one that could survive even selfish or corrupt ones. And that's one of the most important takeaways from this entire exploration. We spend so much time looking for the right leader, the hero, the visionary, the perfect fit. But maybe we're asking the wrong question. Instead of obsessing over finding flawless leaders, we should be asking, how do we create systems that bring out the best in whoever ends up in charge? Because leadership success isn't just about personal character, it's about context. Modern research in organizational psychology backs this up. The same individual can thrive in one leadership environment and fail in another, not because they changed, but because the environment did. Some systems reward thoughtfulness. Others reward theatrics. Some prioritize collaboration. Others reward individualism and dominance. So the question isn't just, is this person a good leader? It's, is this system encouraging the right kind of leadership behavior? That's why, earlier, we talked about hiring practices that emphasize track record over charisma, about rotating leadership, about inviting critical feedback, about avoiding concentrated power. Because when you set up a system that checks narcissism, rewards truth, and filters out performance in favor of real results, you change the entire game. And, let's be real, we need that kind of change now more than ever. We've seen how our current systems, across politics, corporations, even non-profits, often reward the wrong traits: narcissism, manipulation, performative certainty. We've seen how leaders who look confident, even when they're wrong, consistently get more support than those who speak truthfully about uncertainty. And we've seen the damage this causes: scandals, collapses, missed opportunities, broken trust. But we've also seen glimpses of what's possible. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Seretse Khama, Angela Merkel, and Jim Sinegal didn't rise by gaming the system. They rose because their values, humility, thoughtfulness, empathy, service, were matched by systems that allowed those traits to succeed. Those examples give us hope. Because Machiavelli's core insight wasn't that bad people always win. It was that we need to understand the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, if we want to change it. As he put it, many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality. But the way we live is so far from the way we ought to live, that anyone who tries to live as they ought to live will bring about their own ruin. In other words, stop chasing ideals. Start designing realistic systems that work in the world we actually live in. That starts with awareness. When we understand how narcissism works, when we know why confidence is mistaken for competence, why false simplicity is more attractive than honest complexity, we become more resistant to manipulation. We can learn to spot the difference between true confidence and narcissistic self-promotion, strategic communication and manipulative spin, relatable simplicity and intellectual laziness. And when we build that awareness into our institutions, hiring practices, and leadership pipelines, we make it easier for the right people, not just the loudest, to rise. So, what can you do? Start by asking yourself, what kind of leadership do I admire? What kind do I reward, intentionally or not, in my workplace, my community, my vote? Have I ever mistaken performance for substance? Have I overlooked someone thoughtful and capable just because they weren't flashy or confident? And here's another question that matters even more. Have you ever encountered a leader who rose to power without falling into the darker patterns we've talked about? If so, what made them different? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear about it. Because that's where change begins, not in some giant revolution, but in small realizations and quiet conversations that slowly shift the way we think about power, leadership, and influence. If this deep dive into leadership psychology resonated with you, or if you know someone who needs to hear it, please share this video with them. Sometimes the right idea at the right moment can totally change someone's perspective. And if you want more thoughtful breakdowns like this one, more explorations into the hidden patterns that shape our world, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, remember, in a world that rewards princes, be wise enough to see through the crown.